All right, let's tackle one of the absolute biggest questions in personal finance. How much can you actually spend from your savings each year once you retire without that terrifying possibility of running out of money?
I mean, this is it, right? The multi-million-dollar question. You get this wrong, and, well, you could run out of money way too soon. But if you play it too safe, you might end up pinching pennies for no reason and not enjoying the retirement you worked so hard for. For decades, there was one simple answer that promised to solve all of this. That's it, 4%. This single number has shaped countless retirement plans. For a long time, it's been treated as the absolute gold standard. But is it still the right number for today?
Okay, so let's dive into this thing, the famous 4% rule. Where did it even come from, and what exactly does it say we should do?
So back in 1994, a financial planner named William Bengen decided to run a test. He crunched decades and decades of market data. We're talking all the way back to 1926. He asked a really simple question. What is the highest withdrawal rate that could have survived the absolute worst financial periods in modern history, like the Great Depression, for a 30-year retirement? And the answer he landed on was 4%. The rule is super simple. You withdraw 4% in your first year, and then you just adjust that dollar amount for inflation every single year after that.
The key word here, the whole selling point, was safety. This wasn't about what happens in an average market. This was a stress test against the worst-case scenarios imaginable. And you know what? That simplicity and that promise of security made it the go-to advice for retirees and financial advisors everywhere. It was easy. It felt bulletproof. But, and this is a big but, here's where the story takes a sharp turn. Because that simple, elegant rule runs into some pretty major problems when it collides with the messy, unpredictable real world. It's trying to create a perfectly straight, stable line of income from something that is anything but stable, the stock market. And the biggest problem, the main villain of this story, is something called sequence of returns risk. Honestly, this is probably the single greatest threat to a new retiree's portfolio. It basically means that when you get your investment returns is way more important than what your average return is over 30 years. Getting hit with a big market drop in your first few years of retirement can be absolutely catastrophic because you're forced to sell more of your investments at rock-bottom prices just to cover your living expenses. That can permanently cripple your portfolio's ability to ever bounce back. Just look at this table. It shows it perfectly. You've got two retirees. They start with the exact same amount of money, and over their retirement, they get the exact same average return. But retiree B gets hit with some bad years right out of the gate. They have to sell low, and their portfolio runs out of gas. Retiree A, on the other hand, gets some good returns early on, builds up a nice cushion, and their money lasts. Same average return, wildly different outcomes. That is sequence risk in a nutshell. But here's the other side of the coin, the real irony. Because the 4% rule is built to survive the absolute financial apocalypse, in most normal or even good scenarios, it's actually far too conservative. It basically forces people to live more frugally than they probably need to, only to end up leaving behind these huge unspent surpluses at the end of their lives. In fact, some researchers at Stanford found that a typical retiree who sticks to the 4% rule ends up dedicating 10 to 20% of their entire nest egg to these unspent surpluses. I mean, think about that for a second. That's money that could have been used for travel, for helping family, or just for a better quality of life, just left on the table. So if a fixed, rigid rule is fundamentally flawed, being either too risky when times are bad or way too conservative when times are good, what's the solution? Well, the answer really boils down to one powerful principle: flexibility.
The whole modern approach to this is to move away from a fixed rule and towards a dynamic strategy. So instead of just ignoring what the market is doing and taking out the same amount no matter what, a dynamic strategy actively responds to it. This means, yeah, you might spend a little less when the market's down to protect your nest egg, but it also means you can afford to spend more when the market is booming.
So what does this actually look like in practice? Let's take a look at a few popular dynamic strategies that really put this idea of flexibility to work.
A really popular one is called the guardrails method. It actually lets you start with a higher withdrawal rate, say 5%, but you set up some rules ahead of time. If a bad market pushes your withdrawal rate up too high, you gently tap the brakes and trim your spending by about 10% to protect yourself. But on the flip side, if the market booms and your withdrawal rate drops way down, you hit the gas and give yourself a 10% raise. It's a pre-planned system to react to whatever the market throws at you.
And hey, there are plenty of other methods too. Some people just use the IRS's required minimum distribution formula to adjust their spending each year. Vanguard has its own version with a ceiling and a floor to limit how much your income can change. And then there's the popular bucket strategy, where you keep a few years of spending in cash so you never have to sell stocks when the market's down. Honestly, the specific strategy you pick matters less than the core idea. You have to adapt to reality.
So let's wrap this all up. What does this mean for you when you're building your own plan? Let's recap the most important takeaways. First things first, you have to understand that there is no single safe number that lasts forever. It's a moving target. Just look at this research from Morningstar. Back in 2021, when stock prices were super high and bond yields were low, they projected a safe rate of just 3.3%. But by 2023, after the market cooled off and interest rates went up, that number was back up to 4.0%. It all depends on the market conditions at the moment you decide to retire.
So here's the new rulebook. Treat the 4% rule as a useful starting point, a guidepost, but not a rigid contract you can never, ever break. Always remember that sequence risk is your biggest enemy, especially in those first few years. And because of that, flexibility is your single most powerful tool. A dynamic plan gives you permission to enjoy your wealth when times are good, and it gives you a clear, calm plan to protect yourself when they're not. It puts you in the driver's seat.
So at the end of the day, you have to ask yourself a question. Is my retirement plan built for the complexity of the real world with all of its inevitable ups and downs? Or am I just clinging to a simple old rule book that might not fit the reality of today's markets anymore? And that's really the question every single retiree needs to answer.